In this video, I'm going to talk a bit about the Angkor Empire, which was a militarily and politically dominant state that controlled much of mainland Southeast Asia from the 9th through the 14th centuries. This empire was based in what is now the country of Cambodia and was dominated by the ancestors of people we now refer to as the Khmer people, or the Cambodian people, the dominant ethnic group of Cambodia. So the Khmer in the Angkor Empire ruled over a massive state with many different tributaries, a very complex economic and agricultural system, and it was all headed by a supreme monarch who claimed divine powers, divine authority. And we're going to talk about that in detail. One important thing to note is that the Angkor Empire was influenced by both Indian and Chinese civilizations. In the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, Europeans referred to mainland Southeast Asia as Indochina because you kind of have an intersection of Indian and Chinese cultural influences. And we see that in the Angkor Empire. The religion, Hinduism, was an Indian religion. Later on, the Angkor Empire became dominated by Buddhism. But Indian religious culture heavily influenced the society. Politically, Chinese political institutions, particularly the imperial institution, helped to shape this idea of absolute monarchy, absolute kingship. So we kind of see a fusion of two different larger influences. And that's the reason that I mainly cover China and India so heavily during this course, because these are the two central pillars on which East Asian and South Asian history stand, respectively. I'll take just a few minutes to summarize the nature of this empire because it's unknown to many people. The Angkor Empire was based on rice agriculture, which required the construction and maintenance of many different channels of water. Hydrological engineering was at the heart of this society. So the state was responsible for making sure that water was being moved to where it needed to go for the purpose of feeding a very, very large population. And we'll get into the size of some of these cities in a little bit, but just know that the population density is very high in a region where the soil isn't as fertile as it is in some other regions, right? And this involved the movement of large amounts of water. And this movement could only be ensured with the employment of thousands and thousands of laborers, which required a very strong government, a strong kingly authority to ensure that the right people went to the right places at the right time, and the dikes, the channels, the locks were all maintained to prevent both flooding and the land drying up. So this was a very complex system. And because you had high population density, you have very, very large cities with massive monumental architecture, particularly temples and palaces. The temples were kind of the temples were the cultural hub for this empire, because the temples were how the kings exercised the authority of the gods, which is what enabled them to control the hydrological system, right? and order people around to where they needed to go. So we see these huge monuments, these huge cities, this very impressive hydrological engineering, and eventually environmental and military difficulties will destroy this empire, and they will all, and the cities will end up in ruins, abandoned. So just some key dates so that we understand where we're at in time. The great king, Jayavarman II, established the absolute monarchy in Angkor in 802 AD. We'll talk more in detail about that in a moment. But just to place that in time, this is 2 years after Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III. And this is during a period in which both Indian and Chinese civilizations were in decline. The Dong had not yet fully recovered from the An Lushan rebellion. The Dong dynasty was still ruling in China. The Guptas had long since declined in India. You have a succession of dynasties after that that never unified most of the subcontinent. So you have a lot of disunity in India. So Southeast Asia became a very powerful center in this century. After Jayavarman II established the Devaraja system, which we'll talk more about in a moment again, in 802, the empire grew steadily, conquering many of its neighbors. The city of Angkor Wat was constructed in the 12th century by the ruler Suryavarman II. In the later 12th century, under Jayavarman VII, the empire reached its apogee, its maximum dominance over the region. And in the 13th century, the empire began to decline, with a breakdown first with a shift to Theravada Buddhism, another Indian religion which replaced Hinduism, then a decline in political authority, in the maintenance of the hydrological system. The environmental problems began to dramatically affect crop yields and therefore the power of the state. In 1431, the emerging Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya sacked Angkor Wat and effectively destroyed the power of the Angkor Empire permanently. And Cambodia never again rose up to its dominant place in Southeast Asia. When Jayavarman II took the throne, the Khmer people were divided into many petty kingdoms. Almost all of these owed allegiance to a kingdom in what's now Java, the island of Java. And this foreign influence kept kept the various potentates divided and fighting for kind of their place at the foot of this Javanese monarchy. Jayavarman ended up unifying them through battle, conquering the other disparate polities that made up what's now Cambodia. And he established a new system called the Devaraja system. And he attempted to centralize every aspect of life, the government, the taxation system, the military, the agricultural system, under his authority. The Devaraja system, Devaraja in English, was a system of absolute monarchy in which the king was the personification of the god Shiva. He was an avatar of Shiva. So when the king spoke, Shiva spoke through the king. And in certain reigns, kings would claim to be the avatars of Vishnu instead of Shiva. But nonetheless, the power structure remained the same. The Hindu gods spoke through the king. So to obey the king was to obey the gods. To disobey the king was to disobey the gods and obtain massive amounts of negative karma. So the political and religious allegiance were fused into one. And this is what Jayavarman II used to centralize power under him. The nobility could not resist him. He created a massive bureaucracy that was completely obedient to him, and the military and the farming populations were also completely loyal to him. But this benefited society greatly because it meant that while he held absolute power, he had the power to direct the kind of teeming population in massive labor projects, particularly hydrological projects, and the creation of monumental architecture, not to mention the establishment of military dominion over their neighbors. If you want to look back at our examination of the core principles of Hinduism, maintaining good karma according to one's dharma, one's duty, is necessary to achieve a desired state in reincarnation. Well, the king in the Devaraja system had power over this. Your dharma was to serve the king and to obey him. If you didn't obey him, if you didn't show up for a work detail on a hydrological engineering project, or you didn't engage in military service, or you attempted some kind of subversive activity, you would obtain massive amounts of negative karma, and you would be reborn into an inferior position after your death. So we see the establishment of the same kind of caste system that existed in India, though much less pervasive. So to disobey the king was to disobey the gods. And while on the one hand, this seems very strange to us, for example, there was an object called a linga, which is a kind of a votive object, a monument to the god Shiva. It's kind of a cylinder that priests will engage in rituals around to kind of to not only worship Shiva, but to obtain Shiva's graces. In fact, these still exist today and are a prominent part of the worship of Shiva in Hinduism. For in the Angkor Empire, the lingas of Shiva, and I'll show a picture of one in a moment, were part of the king's authority. The priests would perform rituals around these linga, and the linga was not just a symbol of Shiva, it was a symbol of the king and his power. So when they would engage in these rituals, it would empower the king to safeguard the land and to govern wisely. Because you had so much power vested in a single person, this centralized authority was able to direct thousands and thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of laborers, to engage in massive construction projects. So we don't just see the rerouting of rivers with dams, channels being dug, massive amounts of water being moved in. We see massive artificial reservoirs being created. And the purpose of these reservoirs was to ensure that enough water was available so that farmers could grow rice year-round. So multiple crops of rice a year, usually about 3 crops of rice per farmer. Right? So a massive amount of food is being grown in the Angkor Empire, and it's boosting. The result is a very large population, which results in a very large economy and army to dominate neighbors. So the prosperity of the people was part of the king's kind of spiritual mission, and he alone had the power to safeguard everyone's prosperity. So this is a system that ensured loyalty. You not only want to obey the king so that you can have a good life in this world, plenty of rice to eat, secure borders, you want to obey the king so that when you die, you're rewarded, coming back in a higher form. So you would have the construction of massive temple complexes around what were called beres, which were large reservoirs, artificial reservoirs constructed by labor under the king's direction. And these would become centers of commerce, of culture, and also military targets. So I have here an image of a linga. This is the cylindrical object that I was telling you about that was imbued with the power of Shiva and was thus a symbol of both Shiva and also the kings of Angkor and their right to rule and the moral dharma that everyone had to obey their edicts. This system worked very well. It produced massive amounts of food. With a huge surplus comes a huge army. The military was primarily composed of levies taken from the population, usually infantry armed with spears, short swords, and wooden shields. They generally didn't wear armor due to the fact that the climate is very, very hot in Southeast Asia. You couldn't have the kind of lamellar armor that many of the Chinese troops were accustomed to, for example, because the climate, the humid climate, would make it very uncomfortable. In fact, that's something that the Chinese had to contend with during their campaigns in Vietnam, for example, those against the Trung sisters that I had mentioned in an earlier lecture. So you can see here that the extent of the empire was very, very large. These divine god kings conquered massive amounts of territory and large numbers of people, in part due to the great numbers that they were able to field, but also due to the use of war elephants, which they had championed and mastered. The kings were also able to transport large numbers of troops and supplies very quickly over large distances due to the massive waterways that they had constructed. This is another example of how hydraulic engineering was essential to the survival of the empire. Just as an aside, a bit of trivia, if you've ever seen the cartoon Avatar: The Last Airbender, the water benders and the Water Nation, even though they live in kind of Arctic conditions, their culture is actually based on traditional Khmer or Cambodian culture, that of Angkor, because the Angkor Empire and Cambodian culture in general is heavily based on river transport and living on the water. In fact, you have entire towns that are built on the riverside over the actual water. So it's very interesting. But that's just a neat bit of trivia, that their culture, the emphasis on hydrological engineering would cause them to be represented that way in a cartoon. Kind of neat. So at the height, the empire contained around 5 million people. In the central heartland, around what would become Angkor Wat, you had around 1 million people farming, building projects, engaging in commerce. So a very large population, and one that powers in India and in China, even if they had been at their height, would not have been able to easily overwhelm. The construction of Angkor Wat began in the early 12th century under the rule of Suryavarman II, as I previously stated. And this was a massive royal temple complex dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. So this is a shift from Shiva to Vishnu. Suryavarman wanted to construct his own temple that would serve to channel the power of Vishnu into his own projects, particularly his military campaigns. And so it's not just a religious monument, but it's a symbol of the power of the ruling dynasty. So it represents both a shift in religious focus, but also an expression of the monarch's power. And on top of this, when these kings would build these giant temple complexes in the different locations throughout their empire, it was also a place of burial, just like the pyramids of ancient Egypt, or the mausoleum of Chunshawangdi, if you remember that, with all the terracotta warriors. Angkor Wat was massive at its height. It was one of the largest cities in the world, and it had around 1 million inhabitants in the land surrounding the actual city center. Now, the city center generally wasn't inhabited year-round, except for by a very small number of priests. The idea was that people would collect there in certain times of the year, engage in ceremonies led by the king, and then they would disperse to farm, to engage in commerce, etc. But it was the political and ceremonial center of this vast empire, which I showed you on the map previously. So Angkor Wat is dedicated to Vishnu. The temple itself is supposed to represent Mount Meru, which is kind of the center of the universe in Hindu cosmology. It's the single largest religious structure on Earth. So it demonstrates not just how important Hinduism was in the Angkor Empire, but just how closely connected royal and spiritual authority were. One thing I would like to point out is that all of the stones that were used to create this temple complex were built without mortar. They were carved precisely to fit together. The stones themselves were transported from 25 miles away by river transport, again demonstrating how important the hydrological system was to the maintenance of state power. And it took around 30 years for this entire complex to be built. Suryavarman II had passed away before its completion, but he was buried in underneath one of the main towers that symbolized Mount Meru. I'd like to take a second to return to this map and just look at the territories bordering the Angkor Empire. If you look to the northeast, you see the Dong Dynasty, their territories in northern Vietnam. They're going through internal strife and unable to move south. If you look in the yellow territory, that is the kingdom called Champa. and it is ruled by the Cham people. The Cham people still exist. They're a minority in Vietnam today. They're not related to ethnic Vietnamese. They speak an Austronesian language that is very different from the Austroasiatic language spoken of Khmer, spoken by the dominant group in the Angkor Empire. So they were very alien to the ancient Cambodians, the people who dominated the Angkor Empire. And they lived very differently. The Champa were primarily fishermen and seafaring traders that moved along the coast, whereas the Angkor Empire dominated an inland region via artificially constructed waterways. Well, they fought many wars together, and in most of the wars, the Angkor handily defeated the Cham. Eventually, though, the Cham built up a great amount of military strength, and they invaded the Angkor Empire in the 1177, and they caused a great amount of damage, even destroying a number of temples. And this is important because in a system where stability and political power are vested in a god king, if an enemy power is able to defeat his armies, at least temporarily, and destroy a great amount of territory, well, that king must not have the power of the gods behind him, right? So it causes a crisis of religious faith along with political allegiance. Just as it strengthens both together, it can weaken both together when something goes wrong. So this crisis was ended by Jayavarman VII. He was a member of the royal family who rose to prominence after defeating the Cham and driving them out of the Angkor Empire, going into Champa and causing a great amount of devastation and retaliation. But damage had been done to the traditional Hindu Devaraja system. So what Jayavarman VII did is he shifted. He converted to Buddhism, and he encouraged the bulk of society to become Buddhism. Now, Buddhism is very similar to Hinduism in many respects, so it is not as drastic a leap as many people might think from Hinduism to Theravada Buddhism. But he began to portray the office of king very differently, whereas Jayavarman II had insisted on him being a god king, him being an avatar of Shiva, and then Suryavarman insisting that he was an avatar of Vishnu. Jayavarman VII insisted that he was a bodhisattva. If you remember that term, a bodhisattva, in English we spell it Bodhisattva, right? And that's a Buddhist saint. It's not a god, but it's an enlightened being who, if you've seen the movie Living Goddess, right? The little girl is an avatar of a goddess, right? Well, the kings of Angkor from now on will be avatars of Buddhist saints, not deities, but people who lived on earth, reached enlightenment, and out of their love for the human race, instead of going into nirvana and into bliss with the Supreme Creator, they turn back and they try to bring as many people with them into paradise, right? So they don't abandon mortal concerns. Instead, they come down. This bodhisattva comes down in the form of Jayavarman VII and says, "Well, now I'm going to lead you to a better life, a better age," right? And he ruled very differently as a result of being Buddhist instead of being Hindu. While he constructed, for example, the huge Bayon Temple, which is a massive complex. He didn't just build monuments to his power and symbols of his authority. He built hospitals for sick people. He made sure that the road network, the land road network, was just as developed as the canals. And he would distribute food in areas that were experiencing drought or famine. And so he's similar in some respects to Ashoka. You remember Ashoka, the great ruler in India who had lived a very saintly life. Right? Jayavarman VII is moving in that direction. And so the society shifted from a Hindu society to a Buddhist one. Unfortunately, for future kings, the bodhisattva kings, the kings who were the avatars of the bodhisattvas, they would not command the same zeal as those who, in previous generations, who commanded the power of Shiva and Vishnu. Right? So the faith in the state, faith in the overall system begins to decline. So now we're going to talk about the fall of the Angkor Empire. So the end of this Cambodian Golden Age was primarily driven by, well, for starters, you have a shift with the arrival of Buddhism. It's a religion that is more personal at the time. The Bhakti movement that was prevalent in India in Hinduism wasn't present really in Cambodia. So the kind of personal devotion that you see developing in India, in Indian Hinduism, doesn't become as entrenched there. But Buddhism is very personal, so it appeals to people, particularly as institutions begin to decline and degrade. The new kings have less authority, not just because of the new system of them being bodhisattvas, but also because of their difficulties militarily against the Cham in the Champa kingdom, and against another society we'll talk about in a moment. So as faith in the system declines, corruption increases. As corruption increases, the system of irrigation, of dikes, of large reservoirs, the whole hydrological system begins to break down. And that's the worst thing for this empire, because it's effectively maintaining the huge agricultural surpluses that are maintaining the large populations, the urbanization, and the large military. So as trust in the system begins to break down, you have situations where the canals are not maintained properly. Workers are cutting corners. Officials are taking bribes, cutting corners. And of course, the overall net effect is the decay of this very complex infrastructure that society cannot do without. So it in a lot of ways, it reflects, this idea of a competency crisis, right? Suddenly, it's not that people aren't competent enough to maintain these canals in the way that their ancestors did. The motivation isn't there, right? Hard work isn't rewarded the same way. The officials who prosper are those who take bribes, right? And the royal authority is weakened as a result of people turning inward. So you start to see an erosion of political and military power. And that couldn't have come at a worse time than the 14th, early 15th centuries. In the 14th century, in what's now Thailand, we see the rise of the Ayutthaya Empire. So we can tell that this is a Thai empire by the chhatra, the kind of conical tips of these Buddhist towers here. You can see how thin kind of the cones are, how sharp they are. That's very indicative of Thai architecture. And like Angkor, Ayutthaya was a Buddhist society, a Buddhist kingdom. Unlike Angkor, Ayutthaya didn't just focus primarily on farming and on internal trade, but they grew wealthy from external trade with India, and with China even, sailing all the way around Indochina and north and back again. So Ayutthaya was a very powerful state with a very strong military. Since the Angkor Empire had fallen into disrepair, its system had become corrupt, and its hydrological system fell into disrepair, it was very, very hard for Angkor to hold their own against the Ayutthaya armies. And eventually in 1431, Angkor Wat was sacked by the Ayutthaya kingdom, which brought an end to Angkor's greatness and to the empire as a whole. The repercussions of this are still ongoing. In 2008, Cambodia and Thailand had a clash over a disputed temple that resulted in international mediation. The Cambodians look at the Angkor Empire as kind of a golden age, and of course, the Thai are seen as having brought that golden age to an end, and so the Many of these sites are claimed by both countries. In 2025, there was a massive border crisis in which over 500 troops on both sides were killed as they fought skirmishes along the border of Cambodia and Thailand. You had dogfighting with jets, you had artillery fire, soldiers were stepping on landmines, you even had naval vessels engaging in conflict with each other. And this full-scale war was only prevented during a peace agreement that was mediated by President Trump, along with the uh, the participation of Malaysia, as well as the mediation of Malaysia, as well as Cambodia and Thailand. So this is still very much, uh, this is still very influential on this part of the world. It's very important to know about this empire, even though most people in the West don't, and even many people in Asia don't, despite the fact that it was very large, very influential. Okay.